I
All
will.
right.
Okay, great. Okay, welcome everybody. Looks like we have a good crowd together. And yeah, we're looking forward to hearing a lot of great stuff. Very good agenda. Can you move to the next slide? All right, next one. So here is our agenda for today. I'm just going to say really few words, then we have the review of the new catalog of groups and projects working on physical samples and their identifiers that Jens is going to do. Then we have a few lightning talks, and there is still opportunity for other contributions from the audience. So if you want to present something with a 3-minute, very quick talk, please let us know, especially Aaron or me. And then we have a really important, longer interactive deep dive into the application of care principles for physical samples and sample repositories and the data that are generated from samples. So yeah, with that, let's get started. So can you get to the next slide? So I just wanted to remind everybody there are meeting notes. Please contribute. It's always difficult for just one person to get it all down. So the link is there, and hopefully, everybody can put notes in and also comments if you have anything to say. So I just wanted to remind everybody this interest group is actually quite mature now. It started in 2017, was endorsed in November 2017, and has really very steady been steady in having sessions at the RDA meetings. I think we had sessions at every one since P6, and the fact that it has been going on really, to me, shows that there is a substantial interest in samples, and it's actually growing. There's a lot of different reasons for growing. Open science, these principles of care that apply to samples as research resources, research products as well. But what I'm especially excited about, especially in today's session, is that we've really reached the point that we wanted to get to. When we started off, this group was very dominated by the earth sciences community. But we wanted to make this a group that goes across many disciplines and kind of coordinates and aligns best practices, standards, and so on in many different domains that work with samples. And when you look at our agenda today, we are much more diverse than what geosciences has to offer. So with that, I think I'm handing it over to Jens about this catalog. And I think that's also a good indication that we're moving into really this multidisciplinary scope of the interest group. So Jens, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I might try and share my screen to show the table.
Sure. Yep.
You can find the right buttons.
So yeah, Jens, you should be able to share now. Let me know.
And where's it? You should see the link to this spreadsheet somewhere in the notes. And over time, I don't quite remember when we started this, but not too long ago, we started collecting the names and links and some other properties of groups involved with physical samples and identifiers. denoting whether they are national or international in reach, whether they are focusing on a specific sector, academic, government, industry, or publications, what topic areas they're covering, do they use persistent identifiers, and some additional information, also contact information. We now have 23 entries in this list. With the link, you can follow to the document and browse. And I think the rights should be set in a way that you can contribute to this list if you don't find something that you know exists. If you can't add it, send it to one of us in the co-leadership of this group, and see how we can expand this to get a better overview of existing projects in this space. I think they're becoming so many that we need to start thinking about integration with other initiatives, maybe talk to Re3 Data, whether they see scope for expanding beyond data into specimens. Who knows? We haven't talked to them yet, but it's something that we might discuss. I don't know if we have time today, but once we see this expanding, how we can structure this beyond a spreadsheet. I think that's all I can say about this list at the moment. Just again, inviting everybody to contribute your knowledge about projects that we might have missed.
Cool, thanks, Jens. One just quick note on that Re3 Data idea. I have been adding some physical sample repositories to Re3 Data. I did it probably, I don't know, a little over a year ago, when we were trying to include some physical samples in a data management plan for the Fair Island project. So they're definitely open and willing to adding those repositories. So I think that's a great idea. So I think next up we are moving into our lightning talks, unless anybody has any questions for Jens before we move on. Questions about the catalog?
I just wanted, Aaron, just quickly add, if we're starting to list physical sample repositories, there are other efforts that are already doing that, collection registries and so on. So that is a different scope then, and we might just want to link to other efforts that are doing that.
Yep.
Absolutely. Yep. Perfect. Okay. So next up we have Andrea Thamer talking about some of the ESIP physical sample cluster activities. Andrea, do you want me to just keep running the slides?
Yeah, that sounds easiest.
Okay, great. So here we go.
Hi, everybody. So I'm here as one of the co-chairs of the ESIP Physical Samples Cluster. We've been really busy over the last year. Recently, we published an author guide for publishing open research using physical samples. So basically, instructions for scientists who use samples on how they actually reference samples. And we also recently submitted a paper entitled Opening Doors to Physical Sample Data Discovery, Integration, and Credit. This paper is kind of covering, it summarizes both the guidelines as well as discusses some of the gaps that still need to be filled in order to truly make sample tracking and discovery possible. And finally, we're doing a little bit of work with the RDA Complex Citations Working Group on developing complex citations for physical samples, although I'm not going to talk about that a ton today. Aaron, can you go to the next slide? And actually, yeah, the next slide too. Yeah. So yeah, like I said, we've been really busy. The main three products that we've developed over the last year are all centered around this scientific author guide for publishing open research using physical samples. So not only do we have this set of guidelines, we also created a flyer to help advertise those guidelines, which we've been giving out at places like AGU, and that's what this screenshot is of. The guidelines themselves, our next plans are to go through the ESIP endorsement process with them. So basically getting peer review from others at ESIP and hopefully then advertising the guidelines as something that ESIP has decided to back. And like I said before, we recently submitted this paper describing the guidelines themselves as well as some additional things. That was submitted in March. It is under review now. We're hoping to get reviews back in the next couple of months. Next slide. The guidelines themselves are very high level, and to those of us that work with physical samples, possibly slightly obvious, but they boil down to these 4 steps. First, make sure to describe samples with rich metadata. Second, make sure to assign and use identifiers for samples. I think the using identifiers for samples is one of the harder things. So if samples already have an IGSN, make sure to actually use that. Step 3 is publish and cite samples and data sets. This is where we've had the hardest time kind of explaining how to do this in practice because journals aren't really set up to support sample citation. But our recommendations are basically to use IGSNs in data sets when you are deriving data from them. And finally, reference sample identifiers in papers as reasonable. So if you're using a small number of samples, as is the case in some geosciences and in places like paleontology, refer to the IGSN within the text of the paper so that it's unambiguous as to what samples you're referring to. We realize that's not possible for fields that use many hundreds of samples at a time, but in some fields, it's totally doable. Next slide. And and this is a little excerpt from the paper. So something I've been really interested in is understanding what are the social and technical obstacles to tracking sample use. So this figure needs work, admittedly. Natalie Rea and I drew this on a whiteboard and tried to distill it into something a little bit nicer. But what it's meant to show is the network between institutions, people, and technical bits of infrastructure that are all involved in tracking citations. And what these little yellow and red like warning signs are meant to show are the roadblocks at almost every single step of the way. So things that just aren't working the way that they are meant to work. So we're hoping to iterate on this diagram. Hopefully our peer reviewers will give us some suggestions on how to make this a little bit more clear. But I think the next step in our work is to really start breaking down these barriers and identifying things that we as a community can contribute to solutions for. And I think that's about it.
Thanks, Andrea. I love that diagram. That's awesome. Cool. Next up, we have Esther Plump talking about the IGSN data site archaeology community of practice.
Thank you, Erin. Yes, so this IGSN data site archaeology community of practice is a group where we discuss persistent identifiers for archaeological samples on a monthly basis. And so I'm speaking on behalf of the group, but we have about 15 people that are discussing this. And so the group has formed in March 2022, and all of these members come from very different disciplinary backgrounds. Even if they're all archaeologists, archaeology is a very interesting discipline in the sense that we really do work on just about anything. But our main glue is that we're all interested in physical sample management, data collection, and of course publication as well. And I think if you want to remember anything from this short lightning talk, it is that we are actually looking for more input from you. Because our 15 members are primarily from Europe and Australia, and that's not where all archaeologists are based. So if you are interested in archaeology and physical sample, management, then we are very much interested in working together with you. And if you want to join the group, you are very welcome. And I have some contact information at the end of the slides. But for now, the next slide. And so the goals of this community of practice are to promote the use of persistent identifiers for archaeological samples. And we do that via articulating use cases or workflows in different archaeological disciplines. And this we also do via discussing minimum and extended metadata profiles, which is actually a huge discussion, especially moving on to the challenges. Since we're such a diverse group, it's quite difficult to agree upon what needs to be standardized metadata. And what needs to be recommended, or what definitely needs to be obligated to be put into the metadata profiles. Because again, as archaeologists, we work on various things. So this can range from buildings to very small DNA samples that we take from human remains. So you can imagine that not the same information is needed for all of these different samples. If you can move to the next. And one of the activities that our community of practice did in the last period was to send out a survey on persistent identifiers. And we did that in order to well, get more grasp on how aware are people of persistent identifiers in archaeology, but also as a way to stimulate this awareness of persistent identifiers, as well as our community of practice. This survey was open in December 2023 and in January 2024. And as a result, we had 45 responses, which are hugely biased towards Europe, as you can see in the pie chart. So we had 33 responses from Europe there. So the results are quite biased. And they're also biased in the way that 75% already knew of persistent identifiers, but we probably attract people to fill out the survey on persistent identifiers that already are a bit aware of them. So keeping that in mind. But what did turn out to be the case is that 84% was not aware of IGSN IDs for archaeological samples. So I think we really did well in increasing awareness for that. And we also did well in the sense that 67% actually thought that the community of practice activities were relevant to their own work. And as a result, we also had some additional people that wanted to join the community of practice. Next slide. So I would just like to leave it at that. And again, encourage you to join the community of practice if you're interested. You can either reach out via me, Esther, or you can contact Rory Edmonds directly. Rory has been kindly guiding us through all of this discussion and processes. So a huge thanks to Rory from DataSite, and also thank you for listening to this short lightning talk. Thanks.
Thanks, Esther. So Jens, I don't know if you want to take control of the slides again, or if you want me to keep going this way. Jens, we can't hear you yet. Maybe, are there any questions for Esther or for Andrea? Oops, looks like Jens is back. Okay, we'll hold questions until. No.
I forgot
Jens, take it away.
Okay. Erin, if you could keep on running the slides, because there's only 3 changing, makes everything more complicated. I want to give a brief update about the IGSN 2040 project and implementing the recommendations. The really key point of the outcomes of the IGSN 2040 project was the recommendation that the IGSN organization should partner with another organization that was dealing with either persistent identifiers or metadata, so that we could join efforts instead of running everything ourselves. And we spoke to a few parties in this space, and Then in October 2021, IGSN and DataCite entered a strategic partnership to work together on providing a persistent identifier service for physical samples. And this has progressed quite a bit now. All pre-existing IGSN IDs are now aliased from the handle system into the DOI system. The old handles still work, they still resolve, but any new minted identifiers for samples, any new IGSN IDs are now DOIs in the DataCite DOI system. And this minting service for DOIs for physical samples is now open to all DataCite members, but terms and conditions apply. I won't go into the details of that now, but you can ask me or other people on this call to explain to you those terms and conditions. Next slide, please. It's probably difficult to read, but the main message of this slide is that we've been on a journey from entering this partnership, defining a timeline, building the engagement between the two organizations, I've spoken about the aliasing of the existing handles into the DOI system. We're now working on the discoverability of IGSNs so they become more visible in the DataCite system and outside. And following on to that, there will be continued work on support and scaling the system. Next slide, please. Now that the IGSN organization doesn't need to run the PID service anymore themselves, this also means that the role of the organization is changing. And the future role of the IGSN organization that we envisage is that it will be a voice for the samples community, both in DataCite and in other PID organizations. And we see a role for the IGSN organizations in developing and contributing to guidelines for the identification, description, and citation of physical samples. And we want to provide a platform for discipline and use case specific communities. The archaeology community of practice is one of those examples that the first one that we've started, and I think it's been quite a success so far. So we want to support these communities in developing community-specific best practices, develop metadata schemas and control vocabularies, work with them on landing pages with comprehensive descriptive metadata. And since everything needs to feed into the DataCite system, we also will provide guidelines and help with mappings of the discipline-specific metadata to DataCite metadata elements. And that's my brief update on the outcomes of the IGSN 2040 project. Any quick questions? Otherwise, we'll move on with the deep dive, I think.
Yeah, we have time for questions, and for questions for Jens or for Esther or Andrea. We do have. We have a quiet group. So Jens, if we go back just to the, to this. So are you all in this like between like 5 and 7, or are you all the way at 8 in this journey?
We are definitely at 7. So okay. 6 has happened. Everything is aliased.
Yep.
We are at 7 improving the discoverability. There's some work that needs to be done to some technical work, of course, some community work. And then there's the ongoing work of then supporting and scaling the community to encompass more domains, more use cases.
Cool. Yeah, I liked those new roles that you were envisioning for the community too. I think that it'll be interesting to see IGSN continue to step into that space. I think it's an important place. Nice.
So what I was kind of wrapping into the short term of terms and conditions is that to at least give us a better technical handle on recognizing which DOIs are IGSN IDs and which aren't. DataCite now asks their members, if they start registering IGSNs, to use a different prefix, what they call repository, which is a bit confusing, but anyway, use a separate prefix for IGSN IDs, separate from what they use for their data publications or gray literature or whatever thing they're publishing. They also encourage the DataCite members to also become members of the IGSN organization to then support the effort of building the samples community and developing those best practices. So it's not that it's just open to anybody. Yes, people could, but that's not what IGSN, the organization, wants, of course. And it's also not what DataCite wants. This is not about growing at all costs, but this is about growing a community.
Yeah, quick question from my side. Which community is next after archaeology?
I think even though IGSN started from the earth and environmental sciences, for a long time, the earth and environmental sciences community and IGSN were synonymous. And what we see is now, learning from the archaeology example, the earth and environmental community defining themselves as a community. This is something that we started working on. I think the next distinct one will be material sciences, but this is still a bit early. We've spoken to biobanks, so that could also be happening fairly soon. So biobanks, collections of tissue samples. Kerstin?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I mean, I don't think that we're really trying to set up new communities. I think this has to be a bottoms-up approach. And, you know, those communities should form and show interest in, you know, advertising what they're doing and trying to reach out to other groups. I think that's the important thing. So it's not that the IGSN EV is setting the agenda should be set by the community coming up with new. And I mean, the interest I have seen where I'm working now is getting into the marine community, seawater samples and so on, but also medical sciences that is interested in tissue sample identification. So if any news comes up, that's, you know, I think this interest group is a good way to try and reach out to others who are interested.
And I fully agree with Kerstin that IGSN has always been a grassroots organization, and that really makes it special. And you have your hand up.
Yes, I'm working, or I've been working for long in the biobank domain with human samples. So you mentioned biobanks, and I wanted to know if in the interest group you have people or representative of the BBMRI, that the biobank biomolecular resource infrastructure from Europe, because it was listed in the catalog, and this is quite a huge infrastructure. And I know that at the time, but I have not followed lately. They were working on identifiers, and this is that was for human samples. So that's my question: has anyone in the group contact with BBMRI?
I think that was an entry. So we advertised this catalogue at every one of our meetings. And so maybe it was just someone came to a past meeting and added it. Maybe we should add a column, which meeting was this one added to? So
Yeah.
I don't know, unless they're in the audience tonight, I don't have any direct contact with them.
And do you have any suggestions who to get in touch with? I would be very interested. As I said, I have interest here from medical school to work on identification of tissue samples, and I would love to align more with metadata schemas and so on. That's
I think that I can write that in the notes. Contacting Michaela Meyerhofer, who is at a key position and working more on the ethical, legal, social aspects rather than on the technical ones at BBMRI. But she has been there since the beginning of the infrastructure, and she knows really
awesome.
People. And then I had another thing that I have already put in the notes below the catalog in the paragraph in the notes. I am currently still the editor of one journal, which is also mentioned in the catalog, which is the Open Journal of Bioresources. It is 10 years ago it started, and it is meant to give visibility to bioresources. We have two sections. One is on human or samples for human research, biological samples, and the other section is more for agricultural, environmental sciences. And my message here is, I've been searching for a successor to be the editor of this journal for more than a year. I'm going to stop now, and if nobody shows up, which is the case for the moment, this journal will just die, and there are not many journals to describe collections of samples and data attached. So that's just a sort of a call, help, because I think it would be stupid that this journal just dies. So that was a message which is a bit on the side of the session, but it is related to the topic at least. It's a tool, a journal, yeah.
Absolutely. I would like to learn more about that journal, and I'll follow up with you after this,
yes.
but I'm glad that you could make that call here. This is the right group.
Thank you.
Yeah. So Leslie, should we switch into our deep dive?
Yes, please. We're 5 minutes behind.
We'll make it up. So in the outline of this deep dive, we're going to have 3 pretty short talks. I'll give an introduction to local context and some work that I've been doing with a project called Fair Island on our work with Fair and Care. And then I'll turn it over to Sarah Kanza, who will talk about some work that she's doing with the community of practice around care and cultural heritage samples. And then Leslie will wrap up our short talks talking about applying care retrospectively to geologic samples. And I think, just to echo what Kirsten mentioned at the beginning, I think it's really great that in this session we see this cross-domain representation of bio cultural heritage and geology, all working on care and having this forum to talk about it today. So I really appreciate the opportunity to do the deep dive. So to give a bit of a background, I'm going to share some slides that come from Jane Anderson, who's the founder of Local Context. And she talks about mechanisms to support Indigenous interest in IP, and that's really what local context is, or intellectual property. And we're really familiar with copyright and traditional IP, which has ownership and control. Creative Commons came along to give authors more authority. And now what we're seeing with the traditional knowledge notices and labels and biocultural notices and labels is going from this ownership to control to establishing Indigenous cultural authority. So Indigenous rights are able to be represented on all kinds of artifacts. And the other important thing to note in this session is that we're not just talking about cultural heritage objects, but we're also talking about material samples that come from the environment, biosamples, and geologic samples too. And so this is just a quick screenshot of the traditional knowledge labels and the biocultural labels. And they've been really, I think, established in a bottom-up emergent way of, there's been a lot of work with Indigenous communities around the kinds of things that they want to acknowledge. And it's been interesting to me to watch how, we're working with a community that I'll talk about in French Polynesia, how these labels were covered so much of what the French Polynesian, the Tahitian community wanted to cover too, which I just think is, there's been a lot of thought given to these labels and notices. I wanted to take just a minute to show part of this documentary. So one of the ways that Local Context is explaining labels and notices is through documentaries. And so I just wanted to show a quick few minutes of this as a way for everyone in the audience to get a sense of how labels and notices are being applied. So I'm going to stop sharing. And so in this this documentary that I'm going to show, it's based in New Zealand. It's work that's been done with Manaki Whenua, and if many of you or some of you might know Maui Hudson, Maui is in this documentary talking about work that they've done in partnership, applying labels and notices to biologic samples at Manaki Whenua through Manaki Whenua's catalog. So here we go.
Nothing's happening.
Oops. Hang on. Work. Leslie, you guys aren't seeing anything.
We're seeing you.
Well, it was a blank screen that said that you're starting.
Okay, let's try one. We'll try one more time. If not, I can skip over it and just put a link to the chat and we can come back to this. You all can come back to it in your own time.
Oh, there we go. Nope, now it's gone again.
Yeah, hold on. Okay, let's try one. I know. Okay, this will work now. Okay, so this was just, they're showing one of the catalogs and they're about to scroll down to cultural importance.
So you've got all that scientific information, but also I think increasingly we'll see how does that connect across into the Indigenous knowledge.
Because traditional knowledge has developed over a long period of time, it's not subject to the kinds of intellectual property protections that are in place. Within research domains, you end up with this situation where the copyright is claimed by the researcher or the institution. And so our traditional knowledge then becomes subject to someone else's IP rights. Bicultural labels are digital tags that reflect Indigenous interests in scientific data. Now, there's particular sorts of things that we're trying to express through the bicultural labels. First and foremost is provenance, so that connection back to the community, that relationship between the community and that resource that should be maintained and retained across records wherever they sit. The other sorts of things that are being reflected are what kind of protocols have been put in place, in particular, whether or not consent has been associated with that material as well. And then the third component relates to the permissions and the sorts of activities that the community is comfortable with in terms of outreach activities, research use, and giving an indication about what sort of relationship they're happy to engage with researchers going forward. So we've been working with Manaaki Whenua to think about how labels could be applied across a whole series of records that relate to a territory.
We hold about 820,000 specimens, and probably about 60 to 70% of that material is georeferenced, so that we can actually pin down based on a coordinate to a particular rohe, such as whakatauhia.
Location.
Was that geo-referenced?
No.
So what we should do is actually geo-reference that specimen as well. What's the locality? So this is where actually asking Maui where he thinks it was collected would be quite interesting with your local knowledge of it.
I mean, I'm guessing it's probably the Pātaua Scientific Island. There or thereabouts. Hold on, but Littleton Road. That's the Pātaua Scientific Island. So whether it's on there or along this stretch, it's sort of...
Okay, I can geo-reference it to about here.
Yeah.
It's classified using the spatial boundary from native land. So a specimen coming from around a Potiki would automatically get tagged against the Whakatauhia Local Context Project, and it'd get the labels that Whakatauhia have assigned to that material.
We applied the provenance label, connecting those samples back to us as an iwi. We applied the research use label. We want to encourage research to take place, but we also indicated through the open to collaboration and the open to commercialization label that we would like to be involved in those processes, whether they're research projects or whether they're commercialization projects. It's not up to researchers to decide who the authority is. It's not up to researchers to decide what protocols should apply or what permissions might be put in place. That's all for the community to make their own decisions around. But we realized that actually researchers need tools as well. So we created the notices so that they can put something in place that says there are Indigenous interests here.
So there's quite a bit that actually happens under the hood to support how we deliver information out for use. Aggregation and putting it into that global framework is an important part of that. Are the fields and the standards appropriate? That means it won't get lost. And how do the aggregators of that data actually handle and make sure that stays with it?
We know most digital sequence information that sits on these databases around the globe doesn't even have the country of origin, let alone the Indigenous community connected to it. And so us making sure that the biocultural notice is in place, a biocultural label is in place, means that we stay in the mix.
The labels provide an ethical framework for us to express our rights and interests in Indigenous data without needing a comprehensive legal framework, which may never come.
The labels are critical as a tool as we start that journey, you know, just to raise the awareness amongst the scientists, but also as a signal to the iwi and hapu that we want to collaborate with them in terms of going forward. How do we actually do this well so that there's this mutual trust and understanding?
I'm going to stop there. But I think that is such a powerful example of how the labels are used. And so one of the things that I'm doing now is working with a community in French Polynesia. Actually, one other thing to share here. So the documentary mentioned that they're looking for places, or they're looking for ways to include additional Indigenous metadata within sort of the frameworks that we have existing already. And so there's this Indigenous metadata bundle communique that has, in addition to the labels, other kinds of metadata that we would like to see included to describe Indigenous interest. And I think maybe in the interest of time, Leslie, I'm going to switch now, just going straight to Sarah. I have a lot more that I could share about the work that is happening and applying this in French Polynesia, but I think that I want to make sure that we have time to discuss too. So, Sarah, if it's okay with you, I'm going to switch to the beginning of your slides.
Sure. Thanks.
Okay.
I do want to hear more about this, Erin, though, so if you have a chance to talk about it at the end.
And come back to it. Yeah, absolutely. Okay.
So
Okay,
today,
Sarah.
Thank you.
Take it away.
Yeah, so I'm giving this short talk today on behalf of myself and Melissa Craddock, who's also with the Alexandria Archive Institute in Open Context. So digital data in archaeology and cultural heritage is often collected at enormous expense and over many years, and yet data are continually and permanently being lost due to hardware failures, media degradation, software obsolescence, and inadequate documentation. And can you go to the next slide, Erin? Thanks. So much of what is not yet lost is not discoverable or accessible, and will ultimately be lost unless data governance practices change dramatically. And this data loss is not just a methodological or technical problem, it's an ethical concern. It undermines the FAIR principles of open data, as well as the CARE framework for Indigenous data governance. Next slide, please. So we're attempting to address several challenges and questions across different horizons of cultural heritage to prevent data loss, improve data quality, mitigate harms, and advance benefits sharing with stakeholding communities. Next slide, please. Today, we're going to highlight two collaborative initiatives that are run under the auspices of the Alexandria Archive Institute in Open Context. Each is focused on improving socio-technical contradictions between FAIR and CARE to prevent data loss and strengthen data curation across disciplines. Next slide, please. So the first project is Advancing FAIR and CARE Practices in Cultural Heritage. It's a 3-year grant from the Institute of Museum and Library Services to the Alexandria Archive Institute in Open Context. It's very much a collaborative effort, with the co-directors being myself, Neha Gupta of the University of British Columbia, Desiree Martinez of Cogstone Resource Management, and Chris Nicholson from Digital Antiquity TDAR, and a large network of individuals from across many sectors of cultural heritage. Next slide, please. And these people are bringing a balance of synergistic strengths from libraries, cultural resource management firms, data repositories and publishers, museums, agency and regulatory representatives, professional societies, academic organizations, or projects curating and reusing synthesized data, educators, and tribal nations into approximately a 45-person FAIR and CARE cultural heritage network. Over 3 years and through 2 in-person workshops and many virtual meetings, this network will investigate, develop, demonstrate, and promote more equitable cultural heritage data management practices to navigate the 2 very different versions for data offered by CARE and FAIR. Aims include providing clear ethical good practice guidance and digital data governance models, integrating fair and care practices, to improve reusable cultural heritage data, to reduce risks of harm, and to encourage meaningful participation and benefits sharing with Indigenous nations and other descendant communities. Next slide, please. The network is divided into 3 working groups, each addressing a specific research question. So how can we embed fair and care practices in institutional settings that manage cultural heritage data? How can data management practices better align interests across different sectors of cultural heritage so they meet Indigenous educational, cultural, and other goals? And what guides, protocols, training, capacity building, and metadata are needed to make the benefits of fair and care data more equitably distributed while reducing risks of harmful appropriation? So this project is going to review current policies, leverage survey data, and use case studies to investigate current practices and needs. And we envision multiple outreach strategies to promote, expand, and sustain these outcomes. Importantly, this effort is going to help build consensus and commitment toward promoting and implementing fair and care practices across multiple organizational, professional, and institutional sectors. Next slide, please. So the project right now is in its first year, and the main focus in these first months is the collective development of the online survey of cultural heritage professionals, which will help the network assess the state of fair and care practices across diverse sectors of cultural heritage data management, and which will inform our development of training materials, examples of good practices, and guidance such as self-assessment tools in years 2 and 3 of the project. And we already launched this survey in late April, and we hope many of you will be willing to take it. So please visit our webpage for more information about the project and for a link to the survey, or to just grab the survey link here or the QR code. We actually already have almost 500 responses to this survey, so we're really happy about that, but also feeling somewhat overwhelmed with this response rate. But please do feel free to take it. We always welcome more responses. So next slide, please. So this next project, the second project that I'm going to briefly discuss here, is past global change research, connecting data systems and practitioners through fair and care practices. The project is part of the Fair Open Science Initiative of the National Science Foundation, and Andrea Thomer here in this meeting is actually also part of that project. The goal is to network data creators, managers, and curators who represent open access repositories and community curated data resources across museums, paleoecology, and archaeology. One of these repositories is Open Context, with the team led by Lee Lieberman, Eric Kanza, and Melissa Craddock, my co-author on this talk. Next slide, please. So open science is currently the standard in Western academia, yet the emancipatory narrative of open science is being rightly challenged due to historic harms of data extraction on rights-holding communities. This project is asking, how can data creators, users, and managers advance rights holders' authority to control their data, to bring these fair data and the data resources into alignment with care? Next slide, please. The group aims to bridge fair and care from 2 perspectives. One approach is from the technical side of interoperability of fair and care, including data quality, security, privacy, masking, permissions, and ownership. The other approach focuses on relationship building, collaboration, and governance in order to confront inequities and build capacity. Next slide. The Open Context team is engaged in this governance work. We're conducting a multi-stage self-study and data audit. These activities are designed to evaluate Open Context's current practices and public-facing projects that intersect with care and Indigenous data governance. Next slide. These initial steps will lead to new workflows. For example, we aim to address protocols for adding disclosure and engagement notices. This work will also include traditional knowledge and biocultural labels adopted from local contexts and developed in collaboration with Indigenous and descendant communities. Next slide. These results will inform policy review and revision around data and metadata publishing in collaboration with the Data Governance Board. It will also serve as the foundation for the drafting of best practice guidance that can serve as a useful model for implementing ethical open data protocols and workflows. Next slide, please. So just reporting briefly on how this self-assessment is going. Oh, I added another slide, sorry. If you could just go back. So I'll just linger on this slide for a sec. Yeah, so Open Context, I just wanted to give a few little preliminary results. Open Context is publishers of archaeological data. We don't create data ourselves. We publish data contributed by research teams. And when we publish the data, we ingest the data into a common centralized database, and we do lots of review, cleanup, and standards alignment with data contributors. So I'm saying this because there's no like self-service upload option with Open Context, like you see with more general purpose repositories like Zenodo. So to improve our practices vis-a-vis the CARE principles, we're first assessing the data we've already published in Open Context. And we're doing a systematic review of the data sets associated with the territories of Indigenous peoples. We're checking on the documentation and metadata about those data sets to ask if they address CARE-related concerns. So for the 30 projects, plus many more sub-projects relevant to CARE principles, we're asking a set of questions, such as, is there evidence for Indigenous oversight of the research and data outcomes? Is there any statement about ethics and responsibilities? Are Indigenous groups and representatives credited? Is there any formal metadata that describes Indigenous or other descendant community linkages? Is information provided that describes data sensitivities and measures to protect sensitive data? What licenses are the data published under? And would this data set be a good candidate for local context notices? So in this self-assessment, we're finding that we have gaps in lots of this key information, actually. In most cases, we're missing it totally. And in other cases, the information is buried in a long narrative project description or in an outside publication. So we're looking to the wider library and information science community to help define metadata standards to make care-related information more relevant. More evident in these publications. So last slide, please. So to conclude, these data governance and data sovereignty issues that I've discussed briefly today are coming to the fore in several collaborative projects that we're engaged with, but including iSamples and sampling nature projects that this group is involved in as well. But here we've highlighted ongoing work to bridge FAIR and CARE across different horizons of cultural heritage. We'd like to continue by drawing out the shared goals of these initiatives as the foundation for practical ways to encourage adoption of ethical open science frameworks. First, these projects improve the quality of reusable data. They also aim to reduce risks of harm and encourage meaningful participation and benefits sharing with Indigenous nations and other descendant communities. The main way that these objectives are being achieved is through development of guidance and data governance models. Second, both projects leverage networks of diverse participants to devise tangible outcomes to encourage the adoption of FAIR and CARE practices. Network participants include researchers and rights-holding community members who are working across cultural heritage disciplines. And these projects highlight the benefits of collaboration and co-creation of policies and guidance around ethical open data. Open data practices that promote transparency can and should be adapted to support continued inclusion of stakeholder perspectives and interests in cultural heritage data. Through these initiatives, we hope to help to move the conversation beyond the challenges of FAIR and CARE and toward the beneficial role of CARE-aligned data structures in archaeology and cultural heritage. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. We'll go to Leslie. I also wanted to check, Esther, you mentioned that you were seeing boxes on the screen. Are they gone?
It's less now.
Less now. Okay.
Okay, now it's back.
Yeah, so if I do that, okay. So are they gone now?
Yeah, this is a lot better. Now it's fully gone. Yes.
Okay. So our last speaker in this deep dive is a nice follow-on, I think, to what Sarah was just talking about in their systematic evaluation or review of open context. Leslie, do you want to take it away on the retrospective work you're doing? Okay.
Yeah, this is retrospective. So the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies defines Indigenous data sovereignty as the right of Indigenous peoples to govern the collection, ownership and application of data about communities, peoples, lands and resources. This is really emphasising we're not just focusing on Indigenous artefacts or on people's data on the peoples themselves. And the issue is that agencies and research groups have been collecting, curating, and storing geological samples literally for centuries, particularly pre-1990. And again, I have been a field sampler since the 70s. We did not really know the boundaries. There were no maps of where the Indigenous lands existed. And we now have a legacy of collections that could be subject to Indigenous sovereignty. Next slide. And just for an example, on the left, I have the Indigenous Native Titles Lands map of Australia. Dark green is exclusive, bright green is non-exclusive, and the grey areas are land ownership according to the Native Lands Rights Act, and all the yellow areas currently are being subject to Indigenous claims. On the right, I have from the Geoscience data portal, and I think there's about 100,000 samples on that, and that's just from Geoscience Australia. And the black areas are black because they've got so many samples on them, they're just saturated. None of these samples have any information stored about the care principles. Next. And I think it's important to just add that these blue boxes define geophysical surveys. Although it's airborne data, that too is subject because it's data on Indigenous lands. Next. And so the irony is that in 1990 was when land rights officially formally came in, and many of these samples were actually collected with Indigenous permits, with Indigenous peoples on the field team. And I have many, many happy memories of working with Indigenous peoples on my sampling projects. They came out in the field. But most of this information was kept in administrative files in the agencies and was rarely, if ever, attached to the metadata on the sample survey. The metadata was mainly scientific metadata. But although we were working with the Indigenous community, the concerns were more about where were you collecting, what were you collecting. We did exchange wonderful exchanges of different knowledges, but we never really handed back the data. The data was kept in the repositories in the big cities. And there's a lot of work going on about, we've got to get into care. We've got to focus on getting the care principles into data sets for the future. But I feel we need to actually think seriously about these legacy collections and get it back onto them. Because I'll be blunt, we're not collecting samples at the rate. It's just, it's incredible heritage of samples, and we have to be able to use them and use them ethically. Next. But here's the deal, that we're seeing a lot of work coming out about what the care principles are. But from work I do with repositories, they struggle with even basic FAIR compliance. And when you think about it, care is in essence a more specialized set of principles that relate mainly to the access and reusable principles of FAIR. They just cannot be, the repositories just cannot be FAIR or care compliant, particularly for machine readability of metadata. And so I think as a first step, although we're talking about what we need for the care principles, we should also be doing a study on what supporting data infrastructures are required for this as well. And above all, as I've said, there's a lot of people working on it, but we need to get these guidelines a lot more consistent. I can see what Sarah's presenting. There are many groups starting to work on it. Can we bring it together and get a consensus on operationalizing the care principles? Next. And as you saw from the Manaki Whenua example, the movie, getting the local context notices on is a start. And I think that's something, if the repositories have the infrastructure, they could make a go on it. But what kind of terrifies me is, having worked with these local Indigenous communities, they're small. And if everyone goes at them, oh, I've got my survey, I want you to check these samples, what label should I be putting on this? It's just going to overwhelm the system. And so if we kind of use GIS and the repositories from all sectors, government, research, industry, group their collections via place location, and then engage with the local communities as a collective. Because if we go at it like repository or survey one-on-one, it's just going to be too overwhelming. And also to actually start to use our brains in RDA and elsewhere to use modern data management and analytical techniques to retrospectively recurate metadata for the care principles so that all data repositories have consistent attribution of the care principles. And I think that's my last slide, Erin.
Perfect. Well, I will stop sharing. So that brings us to the interactive discussion part of our deep dive. Maybe I'll open it up to questions or comments or reactions. So one thing there, actually, maybe there are two things that I would add here. One is that there's been a lot of discussion in the US, primarily through the sampling nature community across domain about including the care principles in samples. And then one other thing that I can put in the chat is that DataCite has worked with local contacts to identify where in DataCite metadata to include notices and labels. And so we've done some preliminary work there, adding notices for projects from the Gump field station. So I can share some examples of that. But yeah, I wonder, other comments?
I think one thing I'll add, I was thinking about care in the context of what we've been doing with the ESIP citation guidelines. And I think one thing that Stephanie Carroll has said, and I'm paraphrasing this from Jessica Boyce, who is the PI of the Pharaohs project that Sarah and I are on, but has said that making things FAIR compliant can be a step towards getting to care, because you cannot apply care guidelines to stuff that you don't know exists. And so as we go forward with the ESIP, with the author citation guidelines, and also think about like what Leslie was saying about getting this to apply to legacy data. I think one step is just getting people to talk about what they're using and making that more visible so that communities have the opportunity to actually collaborate and with the repositories that hold those things and have a better awareness of what has been historically used from their lands.
Can I make a comment?
Yeah,
Just
Sarah.
thinking about, yeah, so this, like the application of care and FAIR as well, and just kind of like also the discussion of PIDs is that these things take changing workflows. So starting to think about, persistent identifiers and how those apply and using them in your data is the similar thing to starting to think about care principles. And when you're initiating a project, FAIR is something that can kind of be applied later, but care is something that needs years of relationship building. And it's something you need to be thinking about even before a project begins. And so that really requires totally changing the way that we approach how we're doing our work.
Yeah, I mean, that's really what we're seeing on the biologic sort of field data collection, is that it's that fundamental changing the way that you practice going into the field.
I'd support that. And again, as I said, we used to work with the communities even back in the 1990s, but the negotiations that went on before and during, and what's frustrating me, and I've just done what can I say, a data rescue of geophysical data. Those people in those days did brilliant negotiations, and it's all in documents, but none of these documents are attached to the anywhere near the scientific data. And I think there's also a matter of time, because like there's an urgency about this. We don't have the gift of time, because I certainly know we retrieved some documents from one person who was you know, in his 80s, but he still had the field documents from his negotiations with the Indigenous peoples. And so we can actually confirm that these samples or surveys were undertaken ethically, and they were given the clearance at that time to collect those specimens. That's another thing too that we're finding as you start to pull out some of the data retrospectively, that the permits, the legislation, that also changed with time. So if you're doing a legacy recuration, you need to pay attention to the date at which the documents or permits were issued, because as I said, they really do change. I mean, maybe, Erin, if there aren't many questions, would you like to run through your slides? That's
Sure.
whether the audience would like to see the work that Erin's been doing.
Andrea.
Polynesia?
I have one quick question. Has anybody been in conversations around geocultural notices as opposed to biocultural? Okay.
I've been hearing biocultural. I guess maybe it's not hearing, I've just been assuming that biocultural was going to be associated with geologic samples too. And they weren't going to create a separate, but Kristen, I don't know, maybe you have other insights into that realm.
We have briefly talked about geo. There are other issues. I think that you can't directly transfer the bio code to geo. It's different issues. We haven't, been diving into that and really working it out, but it's basically on the agenda for CSAR, clearly, because we need to figure that out.
Yeah. And Joan, I'm also seeing your note in the chat. I wonder if you want to share anything about the recommendations that you linked there.
Yeah, hi, how are you doing? This is fascinating, because the Digital Repository of Ireland worked with the World Fair Project, and they, in a quite, I think, far-sighted move, included cultural heritage as one of their research disciplines. And it was about implementing FAIR within the context of research and interoperability across disciplines. But what the need for care and for labeling, and for the application of labels came up numerous times. And what we proposed in our recommendations was that it sat within the licensing and rights. So the same way you have your CC license, you have your copyright in a copyright, out of copyright, which is an issue we would have in a lot of cultural heritage. You would also have your care or your traditional knowledge labels. The other thing that we're trying to address is I suppose the mutability of cultural heritage records compared to other records. They can change over time because of changes in I suppose, in society and in social and ethical mores. So one of the other things we've been looking at is providing maybe data sheets for data sets, which kind of would sit halfway between a README file and a kind of a descriptive document, which would be updatable and amendable and would set the collection of the data within context, but you could also update it and amend it as you went. I know Europeana we're about to trial them for Europeana in the DRI at the moment.
Cool. Yeah, I think that's something, Joan, that we'd like to keep track of, maybe in the next RDA meeting too, getting an update here on how that's going.
Yeah, we're actually very involved in we just set up an RDA interest group, collections as data. It was the archives and records interest group, and we've now kind of reframed it as collections as data, and it's very much looking at cultural heritage and how we can look at the collections that we have and use them for analysis. So
cool. Other comments or thanks, Anne. It was great to have you.
Yeah, why don't you start your slides?
Sure.
I know you'll get through
them. So I mentioned I work with 2 field stations in French Polynesia, the Tetiaroa Eco Station and the Gump Field Station. And so one of the things that we started with was creating this place-based data policy that if you were going to access the field stations or the places through the field stations, that you needed to follow fair and care principles. But what we struggled with at the beginning, so I'm talking about 3 years ago, was not having really any infrastructure that helped people to do that. And I think, as both Leslie and Sarah pointed out, we are in a changing time where the way that we think about these things needs to happen up front before data is collected. And so really that's where we're going here. And so we've done some work around people have to apply to come to the field station. And so we've been minting project IDs and data site as DOIs for those projects. And so we have all of the connections to the person, to their organization, to their ORCID. So then this lets us use DataSite Commons to see all of those team contributors, and the project at the field station is connected to their organizations, and they have a citation. And so now we think that people will cite their projects in downstream outputs, like with their samples, like with their papers. But we also have included a place to connect to the field station. And so then we see the field station included in the contributors in the DataSite metadata. And this allows us to connect projects back to the field station. And so here you see a little network map of a set of nested projects connected to 2 field stations. But it's really not enough to connect to field stations. That's the whole point of this deep dive of this session. And so now these projects, when they're submitted to the field station, they also will go through a cultural review. And so the GUMP South Pacific Research Station has a partnership with a local nonprofit that acts as the cultural representative and the Indigenous community representative for the place, the Atitia Center. And so GUMP is an institution on local context, and you can see now we have a set of projects. And those projects, this is an example of a project. We can see the links to things like their data management plan, to data that's been collected, to the description, and then they get this ID, and we have a notice that's been attached. And this is that first provenance, or this is the notice that says there may be Indigenous interest here that that Maui was talking about in the video. We will also add a Tahitian language version of this notice in addition to French. And then, as I mentioned earlier, this is how we start to add notices to the DataCite metadata. So it goes into the rights. And then once we have that, then we can see that DataCite puts a little a button here. And what I hope is that fairly soon DataCite moves from the sort of GitHub kind of badge to the local context notices, which should be used all the time. This is not the best practice. But as I mentioned, we have the Atiatia Center, and this is Jane and Hanano starting to create the community side of the local context partnership. And so we have the community, and Hanano is now working on creating labels. And so then with those projects, we'll have labels attached to the projects that indicate the provenance and the consent. Those will be the first two when projects pass the cultural review, that they get those two labels added to them, and then they'll be published. So in the DOI metadata, we'll have the links to the labels. And so this gives us, going from this sort of traditional way of collecting and having, kind of downstream connections only. When we have the link to the project, we'll have links to these field documents that Leslie was talking about, like the permits, as well as also the local context labels and notices. So I'll stop there. So, we're really excited about being able to leverage all of the existing infrastructure to do this kind of work, and to really be pushing forward and thinking about how people do primarily biological field research. So I think this brings us almost to the end of our session.
Sorry, Erin, I'd like to say, I like your idea of the project. And I think really now what we're thinking of is a table, or it's called administrative data, that then goes with the sample. But as you do the downstream data, and like second, third generation, like, Mary was saying, you had the genomic data, but you had no information about the sample. If through identifiers, the data can go back to the sample, and then from the sample, you can go to the project metadata, or what we're calling the administrative metadata table, which is where you'll have all your local context notices. It'll travel with the data. Jens has got his hand up.
Well, looking at other activities happening in PID space, would it make sense to attach care documentation to a RAID?
They actually already...
And then inherit it to the data, or vice versa?
If I just make the comment, I was going to put a slide in, but I knew I didn't have time. The RAID metadata field contains the local context and local notices vocabularies already. Erin, what would you like to say?
Yeah, and just, I think, Jens, RAID is, I think, another sort of interesting example, like IGSN, of also leveraging DataCite infrastructure in some ways. I think that's still being worked out, but so I'm hopeful that the work that we've done in DataCite will also, translate to RAID too. There'll be some working together. So if people aren't familiar with RAID, RAID is the research activity identifier, which is being used to describe projects as well.
Are you working with the RAID people, like with Sean, or?
I'm not.
Okay. Yeah, well, he just had a bad accident. He's all right. He came off his bike, so he's partly why he's not here.
I hope he's on the mend soon.
So do we.
I see there's one more comment in the chat from Petra. Do you expect that applying care principles to samples going forward will have an impact on applications of the Nagoya Protocol? Yeah, I do. I think that maybe I'm not sure I would say impact, but I think that they go hand in hand. I think that Nagoya is another example. So biodiversity, it's a way that countries who have biodiversity interest in research can want to bring that back. And I think that this infrastructure may help that. Sorry, that's not a really articulate answer there, but yes. And Petra, I don't know if you have other ideas on that or thoughts.
Well, I think the same. I just was wondering whether it's more generic idea to support the Nagoya Protocol as well, and perhaps other initiatives, not just for genetic resources.
Yep. Yeah, and coming back to the Sampling Nature community, the Research Coordination Network, they're having a workshop. We're having a workshop at the end of May, and it's on biodiversity, and there'll be a lot of discussions, I think, around these sorts of the Nagoya Protocol and other biodiversity conventions and treaties are also in the mix, and how sample management infrastructure supports those, because I think it's another instance where the policies have been established, but there isn't a real way for people to implement them with infrastructure. So I think there's a lot more to be done in this space.
Is anyone else looking at that aspect I raised, that, yeah, we've got all these people theoretically saying, let's have this, let's have that, but what's the infrastructure needed to support it? Is anyone starting to get on top of that in the US, or?
Kirsten's shaking her head no. Sarah's shaking her head no.
Not really. I mean, this is a huge concern, especially in the context of funders' policies, the National Science Foundation, even NASA, putting out policies that require, data archiving, and the infrastructure that sits underneath it is just limping along from short-term contracts. And it's there have been a lot of discussions, I think, at higher levels, but they haven't led to any great outcomes. And the funding situation at the moment in the US for science is not makes you not very optimistic, so that there will be a change to that.
And it's not just the infrastructure. I mean, that's the next hurdle, and the hurdle after that is the people. The people, we struggle, as you know, we struggle to get funding for people to curate metadata for data sets, and that's just often being able to check the title of the abstract. Yeah.
No, that's what I meant. It's the funding for both the physical infrastructure, the software infrastructure, as well as the people who develop it and maintain it and do the data curation. It's the entire infrastructure.
Oh, we've got to the end of the hour.
Yeah, thanks, Leslie. Thanks, everybody. This was a great, as Esther says, sad notion to end on, but this was a great session.
Well, we should turn that around and say it's sad, but there's, up to 30 people in the room here who care about this, and I think that should be our driver and inspiration for moving forward.
And speaking of people who care, lucky last, Esther is thinking of stepping down as a chair. Is there anyone else who would be interested in being a chair? Please contact us. And I think given our current coverage, we would like someone from Europe, because our current group is Australia and US.
And I think preferably somebody who is not from the earth sciences.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. So we're looking for a non-earth science European.
Yeah.
Maybe, I don't know, Sarah, if you have any ideas.
I have some.
We
We
okay.
might pick on.
Okay.
Try to
Voluntold.
some people.
Okay. Well, thanks everyone. That was great. Worth organising it.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
And
Bye.
thanks, Sarah.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
Bye,
Bye.
everybody.